I want to address the topic of our seminar from a very classic entry point, that of news media. I'm going to recontextualize my talk into the history of the European Union, which, as you know, started as quite an utopian project after World War II, when at last the leaders of Europe decided it was time to do something about these recurring wars in Europe. And they thought about the best way to do a lasting project together was to build something in such a way that all nations had a mutual interest to get along together and to work together. And they cleverly thought, in the context of post World War II, that the best way to start was to do business together, because when you do business together, usually you do efforts to get along, and quite successfully so. When the currently named European Economic Community was started in 1957, this was all about rebuilding Europe and doing business together. When things moved towards something a little more integrated, when in 1993 the European Economic Community was rebranded European Union, the idea was to go beyond economics, to go beyond business. And back then, if you read the literature of the time, the idea was to go to something which included political union, social union, and sort of a more overarching, all across the board union. That was very ambitious, and it was very hard. Along the way, and this is important for part of my talk today, along the way came the idea of moving from a Europe of nations towards a Europe of the regions, although it was not very clear whether we were going from one to the other or whether there would be a blending of the two. But this notion of Europe of regions is actually more important than most people think. The result of that, in terms of creating a more integrated European Union, is that in terms of public spheres, and I will be using public sphere in the very broad sense of the term today, it is the case that the dominant public sphere back then was obviously the national public sphere. Nations were, and still to a large extent are, the place to organize exchange, the place for people to engage in debates about values, about regulation, about working conditions, about health, about whatever else. And in a number of countries, there was also, and still are, a number of regional public spheres. And of course, the idea of the European Union was to develop some sort of European public sphere. The European Commission, among others, but probably in the driver's seat of European construction for these matters, have tried actively, sometimes clumsily, sometimes naively, but certainly actively, to create that space for discussion, that space for debate, that space for engagement across Europe. Of course, this idea of creating a European public sphere was made much harder by the fact that Europe itself, as an institution, was growing, repeatedly. So anytime you try to do something with so many nations, a couple of years later, there were more nations joining the European Union, and everything got imbalanced again. So it was sort of almost an impossible mission to develop this European public sphere, but nevertheless, everyone agreed it was necessary. If you look at the reality, and of course no one can measure that in any possible way, but if you look at the reality of those public spheres nowadays, I like to put the European public sphere on top of the others because it's overarching, but the fact is that it's really hard to find any significant European public sphere. And reality, if you put that to scale, looks more like this. There is still a predominant national public sphere. And the fact is that the media, and that's what we're going to focus more on in the next few minutes, the national media, the media are still predominantly structured around national borders, and that has a huge effect on public spheres. Elections are still organized at the national level, and even the upcoming European elections, in a few weeks there are going to be election across the European Union to elect members of the European Parliament. Those elections are still organized in each and every nation. So that's today. Now, if we focus more specifically on news media, it's interesting to see that historically, the news media have been, since there has been news media, have been very closely associated with public sphere. I mean, the first newspapers in England were seen as very important in the way that the debate was going around. I mean, the constant will to control the content of the news media at different stages of history in different contexts shows you how, at least it has been assumed, that the news media played a very important role in this game. So if you want to do anything along the lines of developing some sort of European public sphere, and if you want the news media to play a role in that, and that makes perfect sense given the role that we can assume that news media have in building and maintaining a vibrant public sphere, then you have to think along the lines of transnational news media. Transnational news media, transposed to this idea of a European public sphere, means you have to think in terms of having some sort of pan-European news media. But does that make any sense, and can that be achieved? Well, it has been tried with some success. But again, this is something, there's very little literature about this. For some reason, it's you would think that I'm being very subjective about this, but I think there is a culture within the European institutions of always looking at things positively, and I think that's fine to a certain point. But there is reluctance to look back and understand failures. And I'll give you a very specific example that many of you might have faced that as well. There's this notion which they really like at the Commission that started, I think, back in the 1980s or 1990s, the notion of excellence. The notion of best practices in particular is something that has always interested me. I've worked a lot on e-government projects with the European Commission, and they kept on obsessing with the best practices. They wanted the best practices to be understood, to be shared, and so that the best practices here could be transposed there. Of course, it was easy to show that that was not so easy, particularly when it came to e-government, because everything in the context was so different that these transpositions were really difficult. But at some point we had discussion with them, say, why don't we include in those structures that you want to set up to exchange best practice something about, let's not call them worst practices, but something about things which failed. Why do we only exchange about the things which apparently have worked? Why don't we share also about things which have failed and try to understand together why they failed and learn from those failures to improve the situation? It's just, I mean, you and I know that intellectually at least, it's just as useful to understand failures as it is to understand successes to move forward in any particular issue. And the reluctance of the European Commission has been constant, and I've never seen any significant undertakings, at least within our field of the Commission, to try to understand what went wrong. And this is a shame, because the European Commission has tried some daring things over the course of the past 20 or 30 years, and some of them have, if not failed, at least they haven't had a lasting effect, and they've gone away. And I wish we could, back then, and of course, the longer we wait, the harder it is, try to understand what went wrong. And so my conclusion would be that we might want to change the focus and to change paradigm and stop obsessing with trying to create a European public sphere. Maybe that's never going to happen, and maybe that's not even necessary. And instead of keep trying and keeping it, failing at it, maybe we can do with those few pockets of European public spheres in specific segments of the population or specific segments of interest, and think more in terms of interconnection between the existing public spheres. There are strong they are lively, and instead of trying to dissolve them for something of a larger kind, maybe we should work rather in trying to have them talk to each other, having them more porous, and in a way work on the quality of the existing public spheres, be they regional or national, instead of trying to dissolve them and replace them by something larger. And by quality of the public sphere, I very specifically think in terms of allowing the citizens in these different public spheres to be sufficiently informed, so that it also has to do with quality of journalism, obviously, to be sufficiently informed as citizens to engage into these debates in their public spheres, being sufficiently informed about what's happening in the other public spheres, so that they don't perceive the others as a threat, but rather understand the difference. So I think we need to think along those lines of trying to change paradigm slightly and stop trying to create something which is probably just a utopia, and that is a European public sphere. Thank you.